Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning into another Supatease video. We got our first update on a lot of specifics on what's going on with gameplay and Transmogs now with 11.0.7. They just recently announced the new zone and Plunderstorm coming back in a video that I'll have linked at the end of this one where I covered that. But now they're actually diving into a lot of gameplay-oriented changes. Some classes are losing some iconic abilities and getting some new interactions as well. But I think the major focus for this one is racial updates. So they are doing a complete update to a lot of races that are kind of dated at this point, and we know a lot of them are just basically not competitive. They kind of just don't exist. You pick them because you like them aesthetically, or you vibe with them, but as far as performance, they're definitely kind of on the lower end. So the first major update that we're seeing for racial changes is that Draenei are getting their Gift of the Naro reduced from 3 minutes to 2 minutes, and if you didn't know, they also changed another part of their racial this patch to basically give you primary stat. So they are getting a lot of value out of that. And now with a 2-minute cooldown, I think that this is a really important modernization of racials, is that a lot of cooldowns for classes got reduced from 3 minutes down to 2, but the racials are still 3 minutes. So now they're completely disjointed with any classes that want to kind of like synergize their cooldowns with their racial ability. I think like the troll one, for example, is a good example of this being 3 minutes. They just don't line up anymore, and they fit in a weird desynced spot. And considering that they did a bunch of class reworks to try and sync classes up again, I think that taking cooldowns that are 3 minutes down to 2 is probably wise in terms of syncing them up. This could likely make Draenei even more powerful, although I think it was actually already becoming more powerful just because of the change to primary stat. For High Mountain Torn, we're seeing Rugged Tenacity's effect increased by 50%. So anytime I see one of these racials being increased by a percentage, I immediately think it's not going to be very effective. When I logged on my level 70 High Mountain Torn, it was like 366 damage reduction. So if something hits you for 4,000, 366 of it will be reduced. If they increase that by 50%, it's now like 450. Now, of course, that's level 70, not level 80. But I can't imagine that it scales up too much at that point. And considering how high the numbers are because of, we've increased player health by so much, I don't think that number is going to really matter with how hard mobs are hitting you and how hard players are hitting you. I just don't see that number being impactful. And it's one of those things where if they overbuff it, then I think it might just become mandatory, in things like Mythic Plus keys, if you can reduce damage that would otherwise be lethal and now it's not, or as a tank, for example, or it's just going to be like this not really useful, small, not impactful amount. So they've got to pick like a threshold on effectiveness for the racials. I think honestly a fair effectiveness would be something like an embellishment level of effectiveness where it's like 2 to 4% of your healing or your damage mitigation or your damage output, and trying to hit the mark on that and have some of them oriented around damage reduction, some of them around healing, some of them around damage, some around mobility or something like that. That's kind of like, to me, would be the ideal power point to hit. But anything that's a percentage increase like this, I don't see it really having a huge impact on High Mountain Torrent's viability. Light's Judgment, which is the on use for Lightforged Draenei, is getting increased to 10 yards, and it's getting its visual increase, so it'll look cooler. But again, they're increasing it by 40%. So they're picking a percentage number on an ability that already does a very low amount of damage. And this is the best example of this is like Living Bomb. Living Bomb, they increased it by 20%, but it did 0 damage, so 20% of 0 is 0. So this ability kind of does 0, and if you increase it by a percent, it's still likely not going to be too relevant. And they also went through to make sure that it does reduce damage beyond 8 targets. So if this on-use ability doesn't out damage your active class kit, or losing something rotationally to use, I don't know if you'll really see play. But I've also seen patches where this racial actually did effective damage and just one-shot people. So again, it's like a balance. Like, where do you fit this in terms of its overall viability? I get increasing its radius and making it more visually thrilling, but again, you're just wasting a global using an ability that's not going to do any damage. That just doesn't seem worth it. Holy Resistance has been renamed to Holy Providence and now increases healing by 1%. So you're going to flat out get 1% more healing. That's falling in like that embellishment mark, like I said, like 2 to 4%. But if they want to make the on use, either maybe take it off the global, so you can just macro it onto one of your other attacks and it just becomes like a cool visual effect for being a Lightforged Draenei, and then it doesn't matter if the damage is non-consequential and it can give them something like this as a passive instead. For Magar Orc, the stats granted from your Ancestral Call, which is a 2-minute cooldown, increases your secondary stat. It's going to be increased by 30%. Again, a very small number. And now increases one of your 2 highest secondary stats. So instead of just 1, you'll get the double whammy on 2 secondary stats. This one could be a lot more effective and a lot more valuable. It's definitely making me think that it could compete with Orc directly, but in PvP at least, you still carry the stun reduction and the pet damage increase, whereas Magar Orc is pet health increase. Unless your pet is actually seriously in danger, but with all the enhancements to things that heal pets now, how easy it is to get them back in the game, pet health is just not valuable. So this is nice. I do think it definitely will edge you a little bit more in competitive viability, but with the other benefits that Orc just gives you passively, it's basically just they're cloning the Orc racial. Instead of it giving you straight damage, it's going to give you secondary stats. So you might be able to stack some verse with this maybe on use and use it like a secondary trinket in that sense. It might be good maybe for Mythic Plus if you activate it running a full Versa set and you increase the Versa even further to survive some big hit. This one's likely, more so going to be shifting the potential viability of racials, I think, out of the ones that we've gone through so far. For Nightborn, they're buffing Arcane Pulse's damage. Again, see 300% with this one because it just doesn't do any meaningful damage. I didn't even know it did damage. That's how little damage it did. But it will also reduce movement speed by 80%. Yay! A 3-minute cooldown piercing howl. I mean, it's better than 50 for sure, but the duration is going down. So it's going down from 12 to 8. So it's like, I don't know if that's enough. Again, it depends on if the number that it hits is actually at all remotely meaningful damage. Interesting that they didn't cap this one on AoE though, for beyond 8 targets like they did for the Lightforged Draenei. I don't know if they're okay with this one. Maybe the cooldown's different. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure the cooldown is 3 minutes. So, yeah, I don't know. Again, this is another one where it's like if you overbuff the number on this, then it can just become a one-shot. But if it doesn't hit hard enough to justify using over your rotation, then why do you even have it? And a 3-minute cooldown snare that lasts 8 seconds, it's like 80% is maybe it's pushing into a spot where it could see some use. It's getting into like the Chains of Ice territory. So it might have like a niche there as far as the slow is concerned, but as far as the damage, it gets really difficult to tune that. For Void Elf, your spatial rift speed is being increased, so the shadow on the ground is going to travel faster. That's really good quality of life improvement. It's also going to last longer, 2 seconds longer, up to 8 now, and its maximum range has been increased to 35 yards. That's a massive improvement. Its visual effect will also be updated and no longer appears to party members. Not that they were probably paying attention to it, but now it can probably look cooler. So it's going to look cooler, travel further, and have more time, and travel faster, and have more time to teleport to it. So that's a massive improvement towards its utility. But also your Entropic Embrace, your proc activation rate is being adjusted. It now increases healing and damage by 5% for 12 seconds. Previously, it was duplicate healing and damage, so now it functions with absorbs. This is a meaningful increase. This is likely a very big, meaningful increase to Void Elf's viability and fits the flavor of it, and could definitely put it maybe in a spot where it's more competitive with the 5% change here for 12 seconds. For Vulpira, Bag of Tricks is getting a 40% increase for damage and healing. Again, it doesn't do a lot baseline, so 40% might not do anything. As soon as the PTR is up, I will check these numbers exactly, but my expectation is that that's just not going to really be effective. But it's also going to decrease enemy movement speed by 80% for 4 seconds. I think it's a minute shorter than Nightborn, but that's a pretty heavy snare. And increase ally movement speed by 20% for 4 seconds, but will only affect a single target. That's a more interesting change to this one. The fact that you could use it for a sprint or you could use it for a snare. It's not really a huge sprint though. Probably more focused is going to be, thrown under the snare. Imagine if you're like a warrior, someone's getting away from you and they got out of range, you can apply a hamstring from ranged. That's a really long cooldown. I don't know if it'll justify losing something that's just like more throughput baseline, but it's definitely interesting at least, I think. But I don't know if it'll really change the effectiveness. For Worgen, your Dark Flight, which is your sprint, will stack with other effects. So you're going to go really fast. So that could be good. In like flag carrying situations, we've already seen like how effective movement speed can be as a flag carrier. So maybe something in Battlegrounds for viability on that front. As far as like arenas, I don't... You could be a rogue double stacking sprint, but it's like now you got Drakthir, so you can just be passively moving faster all the time pretty much, although it was nerfed. This is such a difficult thing to do for them to balance the races and to consider all content. Like they said at the top, they want to consider all content. it's actually it's so impossible to do. And speaking of impossible to do, we get to the last race that's getting updated before we look at some of the class changes, and it's Zandalari Troll. So regeneration is no longer going to stop from periodic damage effects, but it's going up to a 3-minute cooldown, and it's only healing you for 50%. So if you get behind a pillar and you're dotted, but there's no direct attacks, you could use it to recover. But you have to use basically nothing else during that time. So I'm pretty sure anything else is probably more effective unless you're a class that literally can't heal itself. So maybe something like a hunter or a warrior. But then you're trading off a whole bunch of other benefits from the other races. And it's losing out on the Divine Shield regenerating combo that you had for Paladins previously. That was like a full heal. So I doubt that at a 50% effectiveness is ever going to be worth doing it over using your other abilities. I very much so doubt it. So now it's basically removed the niche case that it had for Paladin viability for a situation where it's like maybe if you're a class that can't heal itself and you're fighting only dot classes, which is such a niche situation, and being a 3-minute cooldown, it's kind of rough. They're increasing the embrace of Akuna healing. Look at these numbers again, 300% as opposed to 30, and 250% chance to trigger. And this is literally just your healing procs more healing. So again, if that number hits the wrong threshold, it's going to be insanely out of balance and people will never die, or it's just going to feel meaningless and inconsequential. So this isn't a number that you can like pick once and then leave it. This is like a number that needs thorough testing in order to figure out where it fits in terms of viability. Otherwise it's going to be just way too strong or completely useless. It's set like, this is a really tough one to tune. And then also to consider it in all content. This is really difficult. The embrace of Bwonsamdi, which is another choice you can make as a Zandalari Troll, is increased by 50%. It's basically the undead racial. It procs damage to the target, then heals you. I don't know if that number is enough to really, again, these numbers, like, they mean nothing until you actually play it and then get details and look at it and be like, does that make sense? Is it hitting like the 2 to 4% like an embellishment, or is it just excessively too high, or is it way below that mark in order to know? And embrace Kimball's chance to trigger is being increased by 400%, which is a bleed. You can proc a bleed on your attacks. So that's a big increase to it. But again, I think its damage is not that effective. I pulled open, to look at exactly which ones these were specifically. And what's interesting is Zandalari Troll is basically 6 races in one, because you can choose between all 6 of these. So how do you balance that? You want to balance Zandalari against every other race that already exists, but then you want to balance Akunda Zandalari, Bwonsamdi Zandalari, Gonk Zandalari, Kimball Zandalari, Krogwa Zandalari, and Paku Zandalari against every other race that already exists. This is basically 6 races in one. To balance them against each other and then balance them also against everything else in the game is literally impossible. It will never happen. And I don't know how much time you would have to waste in order to actually make that happen, because it just will literally never happen. It will never happen. Also, not to mention that Paku is still at 4% crit for 12 seconds, which I think is the baseline one that players are selecting for this. I think it's mostly Paladins, right? Holy Paladins. You get the 4% crit, which is one of your best stats. You get the bubble regenerate heal, and that was kind of the niche you used for Zandalari, if somebody was going to pick it. All these other ones are just really passive mitigation-oriented ones. This one would just directly compete with High Mountain. The bleed could be interesting because you could be a caster, and then you can apply physical damage to something. So if they go immune to magic, you have some damage coming through, but then how much damage is it going to do? Because if it's doing an excessive amount, then it's going to be like gushing wounds. It's going to be really oppressive. But if it doesn't do any meaningful damage, then who really cares? A lot of classes, it could maybe stop someone from stealthing. But a lot of classes have stealth protection in PvP when I'm considering that. Movement speed of Gonk is just directly competing with Drakthir, and I think Drakthir is probably still faster than if you go with this. And then this is just the undead racial cloned. Like Bwonsamdi is the undead racial, except you don't get Lichborn, or you don't get the ability to get out of fear. Like, how do you do this? To me, honestly, they should just make these all cosmetic. Pick one effect and give it to every Zandalari Troll, whatever it is. It could be a combination of all these. And then you can pick your Loa, and it spawns a little ghost Loa that flies around your head. And it's a cosmetic choice. You log into a Zandalari and you can pick your Loa, and he's like the ghost that's talking to you like Bwonsamdi did in BFA, and it's just cosmetic. And you don't bother wasting your time trying to balance these 6 different things against each other and against everything else in the game, because I don't ever see that happening. I just don't see that happening. Now when we look at spell changes, they're deleting focused growth for Resto Druid, which is the stacking life bloom effect. And I don't know if this is like very early data mining, I think, that's going into this. So this might not actually happen, or it might go back on it, but this is like a core mechanic to Resto Druid to stacking Life Bloom, and could fundamentally change how it operates in PvP if they go ahead with this, as far as removing it and increasing their viability or lowering their viability. But this was a massive one. The next one was Evokers. Rescue is now going to pull clear movement effects. So if you got rooted, you can now rescue someone, and if they're rooted, you can still rescue them and pull them. So that's a massive quality of life improvement, and also gives you a way to get out of Solar Beam as a boomkin, which I'm annoyed about, because you could be root Solar Beamed, and because it's not a spell, you can use it when you're silenced. You could rescue yourself out of a Solar Beam. Now every healer can get out of a Solar Beam. Yes, I'm angry about that. Okay, and then there was one more. I think it was for Mage. So if you're a warrior or something like that, you're gonna be really happy about this. It's basically the proccing Ice Novas aren't going to root enemies. They don't freeze enemies in place. You'll proc the damage from it, but it's not going to root the target. So massive quality of life improvement for melee classes against mages. This needed to happen. I was honestly surprised it didn't happen sooner, because it's one of the reasons why a lot of classes like Warrior, Demon Hunter, Windwalkers, and Enhancement Shamans, they really just can't do anything, is this proccing Ice Nova root. So that's gone. Evokers have a way to get out of Beam and just roots in general, which is a huge quality of life improvement. And Resto Druid, I don't know what's going on. They either hate you or they've got some really big plans for you moving into the future. But yeah, that's basically it for the class changes. We got some cool transmogs here. We'll just close the video out with this. Look at this. We can get a clock fist from like a gnome transmog. It looks insane. We got like gauge oriented guns for the Wild West themes of the island, clockwork looking shields, Reinhardt clockwork looking weapons, like really good like gnome style looking transmogs, like really cool. So I thought these transmogs were really cool. I just wanted to flip them quickly to you to show them, discuss some of the racial changes that are coming through and my thoughts on them, and like what is like the likelihood of hitting the mark with these types of changes. And it's like you're either going to hit the scale and it's going to tilt too far, and then those are now the new meta races, or you're not going to hit hard enough and nobody's really going to acknowledge it. It's a really tough thing to actually accomplish. But those are my thoughts. Those are my takes. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. I hope you guys enjoyed this update. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.